My name is Emily Carter, and 3 months ago my husband signed divorce papers thinking he had just won the biggest victory of his life. What he didn't know was that the moment he signed those papers, he also signed away the future he had been secretly dreaming about. Because the woman he thought was broke, ordinary, and easy to replace was actually the richest woman in Seattle. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it all began. 5 years ago, I was standing in a small coffee shop near Pike Place Market, wearing a plain sweater, holding a laptop that looked like it had survived 10 years of college. Across the room sat Daniel Brooks, the man who would later become my husband. At the time, he was charming, confident, and full of dreams. He talked about building his own company, becoming successful, and creating a life that most people only imagine. Back then, I smiled and listened quietly. What Daniel didn't know was that my family already owned half the tech buildings downtown. My father, Robert Carter, built Carter Global Holdings into one of the largest investment firms on the West Coast. But I never liked the attention that came with money. So I lived simply. No designer clothes. No luxury car. No security guards. Just Emily. And somehow, Daniel fell in love with that version of me. Or at least that's what I believed. We met almost every day after that. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long walks along the Seattle waterfront. He would hold my hand and talk about our future. "I don't care about money," he once told me while watching the sunset over Elliott Bay. "I just want someone loyal beside me." At that moment, I believed him. So when he proposed 2 years later, in that same coffee shop, I said yes. Our life after marriage seemed normal. We rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill. Daniel was building his startup company, and I supported him in every way I could. Emotionally, mentally, even financially. Although he never knew that the small investments I suggested were actually coming from connections I quietly arranged through my father's company. Within 3 years, Daniel's startup suddenly started growing faster than anyone expected. New investors appeared. Partnership deals were signed. His company began appearing in tech news. And Daniel changed. Slowly at first. Then completely. He started coming home later. Phone calls he wouldn't explain. Business trips that felt suspiciously unnecessary. And the way he looked at me started changing too. Like I was holding him back. Like I was the embarrassing past he had outgrown. One night, I overheard him speaking to someone on the phone in the living room. "I just need to finalize the divorce," he whispered. "She's not at my level anymore." Those words felt like someone dropped ice directly into my chest. But what hurt the most was what he said next. "She has nothing anyway. She'll walk away with almost nothing." I stood silently in the hallway, listening. That was the exact moment I realized something important. Daniel never loved me. He loved the version of me he thought he could eventually leave behind. So I did something he would never expect. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. Instead, I started planning. But before I continue, let me ask you something. If you discovered your partner was secretly planning to leave you the moment they became successful, would you confront them immediately? Or would you stay quiet and watch what they do next? Because I chose the second option. And that decision changed everything. 2 weeks later, Daniel came home with a serious expression. He placed a folder on the table. "I think we should talk about our future," he said calmly. I looked down at the papers. Divorce papers. He had already signed them. Daniel leaned back confidently, like a man completely in control. "Emily, this just isn't working anymore." I slowly picked up the pen. And without saying a single word, I signed. Daniel smiled with relief. He thought he had just freed himself from a woman who had nothing. But what he didn't know was that the next morning, the board of Carter Global Holdings would be making a decision that would turn his entire life upside down. And his company was about to become part of that decision. The next morning, I walked into the Carter Global Holdings headquarters for the first time in almost 2 years. The glass tower stood proudly in downtown Seattle, reflecting the cloudy morning sky. It was one of the most recognizable buildings in the city, but very few people inside knew what I actually looked like. That was intentional. Growing up as Robert Carter's daughter meant living under constant attention. Reporters, investors, business rivals. Everyone always wanted something. So after college, I chose a different life. I stayed behind the scenes. Most people in the company only knew me as a silent shareholder. But that morning, things were about to change. As I stepped into the private elevator, the receptionist looked at me with confusion. "Excuse me, miss, the executive floors are restricted." I smiled politely. "Don't worry," I said calmly. "They're expecting me." 30 seconds later, the elevator doors opened directly into the boardroom floor. Inside, 12 board members were already seated around the long table. And at the head of that table sat my father, Robert Carter, one of the most powerful investors on the West Coast. He looked up as I walked in and gave a small, proud smile. "Well," he said, "look who finally decided to come back." I took my seat beside him. "Good morning, everyone." Some of the board members looked surprised, some curious, and a few already understood exactly what was happening. My father cleared his throat. "Let's begin." A large screen behind him lit up, displaying the name of a company, Brooks Tech Solutions, Daniel's company. One of the board members began presenting. Over the past 3 years, Brooks Tech has grown rapidly thanks to several strategic investment channels. I couldn't help but smile slightly. Those channels had mostly been mine, quietly arranged, carefully guided. Every contract, every investor introduction, every funding round. Daniel thought he had built his success through pure genius. In reality, someone had been moving the chess pieces behind the board. And today, the final move was about to happen. The presentation continued. "Based on our analysis, Brooks Tech's technology has strong long-term potential," another executive explained. "Acquiring a controlling share would significantly strengthen Carter Global's tech portfolio." My father leaned back in his chair. "So, the recommendation is acquisition?" The executive nodded. 51% controlling ownership. The room fell silent for a moment. Then my father turned toward me. "Emily," he said calmly, "you've been very quiet today." 12 pairs of eyes suddenly looked in my direction. I folded my hands on the table. "Brooks Tech has potential," I said softly. "But the CEO lacks discipline." A few board members raised their eyebrows. I continued. "He's ambitious but short-sighted." My father smiled slightly. "And what would you recommend?" I looked at the screen displaying Daniel's company logo. Then I answered. "We acquire the company." Another pause filled the room. "But," I added calmly, "we replace the CEO." Now the room reacted. One board member leaned forward. "You mean immediately after acquisition?" I nodded. "Yes." My father tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "And who exactly would manage the transition?" I met his eyes. "I will." The room went silent again. Not shocked, just impressed. Because they knew something Daniel didn't. When I commit to something, I never lose. My father slowly smiled. "Well then," he said, "let's take the vote." One by one, the board members raised their hands. Approval, approval, approval. Within 60 seconds, the decision was unanimous. Carter Global Holdings officially acquired 51% of Brooks Tech Solutions. Daniel Brooks no longer owned his own company. Technically, he now worked for me. I stood up from the table. "Prepare the announcement," my father said to the legal team. "Also schedule a meeting with Brooks Tech's CEO this afternoon." He glanced at me. "You'll be attending, of course." I picked up my coat. "Of course." As I walked toward the elevator, my phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. "Daniel.
Hey.
We need to meet tonight to finalize the divorce details." I looked at the message for a few seconds. Then I typed a simple reply. "Emily.
Sure.
Let's meet tomorrow morning instead." I smiled slightly as I pressed send. Because tomorrow morning, Daniel wouldn't just be meeting his ex-wife. He would be meeting the new majority owner of his company. And he still had absolutely no idea. The next morning, the sky over Seattle was gray and quiet, the kind of morning that makes the entire city feel calm before something big happens. I arrived at the Carter Global headquarters 20 minutes early. The boardroom was already prepared. Documents neatly placed. Coffee on the table. Legal advisors waiting. Today wasn't just a meeting. It was the moment Daniel Brooks would finally understand the truth. At exactly 9 a.m., the elevator doors opened. Daniel walked in confidently, wearing the same expensive suit he had bought after his company's first major funding round. He looked relaxed, even slightly proud. To him, this meeting was just another corporate discussion about a possible partnership. When he saw me sitting quietly at the far end of the table, his expression changed. "Emily," he said, confused. "What are you doing here?" Several executives glanced between us. I simply looked up at him. "Good morning, Daniel." He gave a small laugh. "Did you come here to support me or something?" He walked toward the chair across from me, clearly assuming I was just a guest. Before he could sit down, one of the legal advisors spoke. "Mr. Brooks, please take the seat beside the presentation screen." Daniel frowned slightly, but followed the instruction. The meeting began. A senior executive stood and started the presentation. As of this morning, Carter Global Holdings has completed a controlling acquisition of Brooks Tech Solutions. Daniel straightened in his chair. "What?" The executive continued calmly. "The firm has acquired 51% of company shares." Daniel looked around the room. "That's impossible. No one owns that much of my company." Another slide appeared on the screen. It showed the list of investors. And, at the top of the list, Carter Global Holdings. Daniel's voice hardened. "This is some kind of mistake." "No," someone answered calmly. "It isn't." Then the final slide appeared. New executive leadership, Brooks Tech Solutions. Daniel stared at the name displayed under majority owner and acting executive director. Slowly, he turned toward me. And for the first time since I met him, Daniel Brooks looked completely speechless. "Emily," he whispered. I stood up slowly. "Yes." The room was silent. Daniel's eyes searched my face, trying to process everything at once. "You work here?" I shook my head slightly. "No." Then I finished the sentence he wasn't ready to hear. "I own it." The silence became heavy. One of the board members spoke formally. "Allow us to introduce Emily Carter, principal shareholder of Carter Global Holdings." Daniel's face drained of color. "Carter?" His mind finally connected the pieces. Robert Carter. Carter Global. Emily Carter. The realization hit him like a wave. "You," he muttered. "You were hiding this the whole time?" I looked at him calmly. "I wasn't hiding it. I just never needed to prove anything." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly shaken. "So, everything, the investors, the contracts." I nodded. "Most of them." He stared at me like he was seeing a completely different person. "Why didn't you tell me?" I held his gaze. Because the moment money enters a relationship, people start showing their true intentions. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, he asked the question that had clearly been burning in his mind. "So, what happens now?" I looked around the boardroom briefly before answering. "Now we discuss the future of Brooks Tech." One of the legal advisors placed a document in front of Daniel. "Due to the leadership transition, the board has voted to appoint a new acting executive director." Daniel didn't even look at the document. His eyes stayed on me. "You're replacing me?" I answered honestly. "Yes." He laughed quietly, but there was no confidence in it anymore. "Because I asked for a divorce?" I shook my head. "No." "Because you believe success made you better than everyone around you." Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time, he looked small. Not angry. Not arrogant. Just defeated. The man who once believed he controlled everything now realized he had never truly been in control. After a long moment, he slowly signed the leadership transition document. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. The meeting ended shortly after. As people began leaving the room, Daniel stopped beside me. His voice was quieter now. "Emily, if I had known, things would have been different." I looked at him one last time. "That's exactly the problem. You only valued me once you realized what I had." Daniel had no response. He simply nodded and walked toward the elevator. And just like that, the man who once believed I had nothing walked out of a company he no longer owned. Later that evening, I drove down the Seattle waterfront again. The same place where Daniel once promised he didn't care about money. The city lights reflected across the water as the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. For the first time in a long time, everything felt quiet, peaceful. The divorce was finalized a week later. Daniel left Seattle shortly after. And Brooks Tech? Under new leadership, the company grew even faster than before. But this time, it was built on something stronger than ambition. It was built on truth. And as for me, I finally stopped hiding who I was. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming the person they never believed you could be, and living a life they can never be part of again.